Begin this morning at the Vatican, where it is now 1 p.m. Mourners from around the world are gathering right now to pay their respects to Pope Francis. As you know, he died yesterday at the age of 88 after leading the Catholic Church for more than 12 years. Now, the Vatican has announced the late pontiff's body will be moved to St. Peter's Basilica tomorrow to lie in state. His funeral will be held Saturday at 10 a.m. local time, which is 4 a.m. Eastern. CBS News papal contributor Delia Gallagher joins us now from Rome with more on this. Delia, good morning to you. Help us understand what the plans for the funeral are and note the changes that Pope Francis made to these plans in the past year.
Well, you know, Errol, of course, a funeral of a pope is something that the Vatican has done for millennia now. And so there are very hard and fast rules about how it happens. A book about this thick is issued by the Vatican with all of the prayers and all of the people and who's going to say it and who's going to move when. What Francis has changed in that is he has asked for, in his last will and testament yesterday, as simple as possible, a funeral and a burial. So mainly his changes have to do with the type of casket that he's been buried in, just a simple wooden casket instead of the usual 3 caskets that a pope is buried in. And then his actual burial grounds, which, as we know, will not be here at St. Peter's, but will be at Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major, another basilica that was very close to Francis's heart. And in that testament, he said he would like to just be buried in the ground with a simple inscription on top that says Franciscus. So his whole desire for the funeral has been to keep it as simple as possible, which of course the cardinals will keep in mind. But they also have to balance that with the centuries-long tradition of papal funerals. So I'm sure we will see all of the pomp and circumstance of a traditional papal funeral as well, Errol.
Right, but Pope Francis, I guess, underscoring that humility with those changes that he is well known for. The world has had a full day now to absorb his passing. I'm wondering what's happening at the Vatican today and if the mood has shifted at all.
You know, Errol, it's really kind of the calm before the storm right now. There are tourists here that have been here probably since Easter, but what's really happening is you've got to imagine that on the city of Rome and Vatican security now has sprung up this major security mobility. So we've got helicopters flying overhead, we've got streets being cordoned off, preparation for the hundreds of thousands of people that are likely to come for this funeral, and heads of state as well. So there's a massive security operation happening around the Vatican as we speak. As we know, Pope Francis's body will be laid in state on Wednesday, so tourists that are going in today are just seeing the Basilica, but starting tomorrow they'll be able to see and pay their respects to his body. Now, what's going on inside the Vatican is that the cardinals have already started this morning what they're called general congregations. Those are their meetings. They happen every day up until the conclave. Once you get to the conclave, they will start talking about who they want to elect as a new pope in those general congregations, or at least the general characteristics. But right now, they're discussing logistical issues about the funeral and when they wanted to have it, which they've announced on Saturday at 10, and all of the kind of logistical items that need to be dealt with when it comes to the death of a pope. And then, of course, they will need to set the date for the conclave, which they haven't yet announced, but it needs to be between 15 and 20 days from the death of a pope.
A great reminder of just how many details there are to manage between now and then. Delia Gallagher joining us from Rome. Thanks so much. Senior members of the Catholic Church are expected to begin their conclave to elect Pope Francis's successor in the next 3 to 4 weeks. For more on what that entails, I'm joined now by Michael Sean Winters. He's a writer for the National Catholic Reporter. Michael, thanks for being with us today. Before we jump into the cardinals, I'm just wondering if you could update our viewers on what we know about what caused the Pope's death.
He had a stroke that was followed by incurable or irreversible coronary failure, is what the Vatican said yesterday. So, you know, his body gave out. I mean, I don't think it's more complicated than that. He pushed himself on Easter itself, and, you know, he was 88 and should have been quietly convalescing at home. But this was Francis. He wanted to be out with the people, and it took its toll.
That's right. All right. Now, we know that many of the cardinals heading to Rome now, they will have never met before. So how exactly will the conclave proceed?
I think most of them will have met at least some of the other cardinals. The whole body has not gathered since the last consistory, which, because of the timing of the last consistory, a lot of cardinals were actually not there. But many of them were at the synod, which was a 2-year process in 2023 and 2024. And once they gather, they will gather in daily meetings in the morning and in the afternoon, where each of them gets up and speaks about the needs of the church as they see it and what kind of pope they think that they're looking for. And during the coffee breaks, during the lunches, dinners afterwards, that's really when they get to know each other and start, looking at each other, not just as a colleague, but seeing, who could be pope, who could be in white sitting in the throne rather than sitting next to me in red.
Yeah, they'll be literally sizing each other up. I'm wondering it might be too challenging to ask you who are the leading contenders, but I'll ask you who are the leading contenders, or at least what traits are they likely to have?
I suspect it's very interesting. The names that are being thrown about, the most conspicuous fact is the absence of a Latin American. And yet, given the large numbers of cardinals in Latin America, and I think the perception that the Latin American church really received the teachings of the Second Vatican Council very well, and that Francis was kind of bringing that to bear, I think you will see a Latino candidate emerge in the next couple of weeks. I don't think it's going to go back to an Italian. I don't think it's going to go back to a European. I wouldn't be surprised if, say, the Cardinal Archbishop of Tokyo, who leads the Catholic relief services around the world, it's called Caritas Internationalis, and therefore has done a lot of travel. I don't think it will be an American. I think Cardinal Joe Tobin is one American who will get some votes and is certainly very well regarded throughout the world. He used to lead the Redemptorist Order, and so he's traveled all over the world. But I think it's safe to say it's unlikely an American will be elected.
Okay, those are certainly some interesting predictions, and we will have much more on the Pope's funeral and what comes next in just a few minutes. Michael Sean Winters, thanks very much. Let's now get the Trump administration's perspective on all of this with, you see it right there on your screen, CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand at the White House. Natalie, good morning to you. How is President Trump honoring Pope Francis?
Good morning, Errol. Well, we learned from the president's social media that he and the First Lady will be attending the Pope's funeral later this week on Saturday. That is big news out of the White House. The president yesterday also ordered that all flags, federal flags, be flown at half-staff in his honor. And during his remarks at the annual Easter egg roll, he called Pope Francis a very good man who loved the world, saying he especially loved people who were having a hard time. Now, as we know, as we were talking about yesterday, President Trump at times has clashed, including clashed publicly with Pope Francis over policy positions, particularly on immigration, migration, and deportation policy. But it's important to note that when President Trump met with Pope Francis back in 2017, he did appear humbled by that experience and has had very nice things to say about the Pope since then.
As nearly 1.4 billion Catholics are mourning the death of Pope Francis, many are reflecting on the legacy he leaves behind. CBS News special correspondent Nora O'Donnell has more from Rome about the plans to lay the pontiff to rest.
Pope Francis won't be buried at the Vatican like most pontiffs. Instead, he will be buried here at the Basilica of St. Mary Major. It is the largest and most important Marian church in all of Rome. And Pope Francis loves this basilica and has visited it over 100 times, coming here to worship before and after every single one of his international trips. The Holy Father prays to this specific Byzantine icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's called Our Lady Salus Populi Romani, literally means salvation of the Roman people. We visited the basilica and went inside to see the area where it is believed Pope Francis will be laid to rest. It'll be inside or next to the Pauline Chapel in the Basilica, where he has spent so much time. We learned that after he had surgery in 2021, he came here to pray before returning to the Vatican. And it really is beautiful inside. Pope Francis won't be the only pope buried here. There are 7 other popes inside, but Francis will be the first in more than 350 years. When we met Pope Francis last year, we learned how he is devoted to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Just above our interview was the painting of Mary, undoer of knots, inside his home in Casa Santa Marta. Pope Francis discovered the saint in the 1980s when he was going through a dark time, and the devotion resonated with him because it symbolizes Mary's role in the undoing of the knots of life's problems. This funeral for Pope Francis will follow many of the centuries-long traditions for popes, but there will be changes. He made changes to the funeral ceremonies just last year. And so his funeral will symbolize, in many ways, his papacy, the simplicity and humility.
For more developments out of the Vatican, I'm joined now by CBS News special correspondent Norah O'Donnell in Rome. Norah, it was this time yesterday, you and I were speaking, and we were really absorbing that sense of loss from the Pope's passing. I'm wondering what it's like for you to be near the Vatican now.
Yes, well, we have landed here in Rome, and I have to tell you, Errol, I have been here 3 times in the past year, and I have never seen it so crowded. I think that's because many pilgrims are here after Easter, but also many coming to pay their respects ahead of Pope Francis is going to lie in state in St. Peter's Basilica starting tomorrow. And then, as you mentioned, that funeral will be on Sunday. So Rome is really packed right now with people who are here to witness this really historic moment and to say, in some ways, a final goodbye to Pope Francis. I'm looking toward what it will be like on Saturday to have this entire area filled. You're talking about millions of people who will come here to witness that Mass that will happen on Saturday morning. Errol?
And Norah, I know that yesterday we were speaking about your interview with Pope Francis at the end of last year, and so many of the exchanges you had keep jumping out at me. I'm wondering for you, now that the world is talking about legacy and looking at the life of Pope Francis, if any of your exchanges with him take on a new meaning now.
It's a great question. You know, I think his legacy will be one of great compassion and inclusiveness. And we really got that sense from our interview, which was almost exactly 1 year ago. We were here interviewing him at the Casa Santa Marta, which is actually not far from where I am now. It's this guest house, and that is actually where he is lying in a small chapel right now. We got those pictures from the Vatican this morning. When I think about things from that interview, one was how generous he was with his time. We spent an hour with him, and I really did find him very warm and funny. You know, when I asked him if he likes being called the People's Pope, he laughed and he smiled so broadly, because I think that's really what he did want to be remembered. You know, what we saw under Pope Francis was this shift from a very doctrinally rigid Catholic Church into the more pastoral outreach. And even in his final day and hours, we saw that about Pope Francis, right? With the people. He was here in St. Peter's Square, in the Pope Mobile, able to embrace children and wave at the crowds. And so he was trying to bring the church closer to the people. And that was really his approach. And then I think, you know, as we've talked about that tone from Pope Francis, there's a lot, too, that he did. I mean, I was looking back over some of the things that we talked about with him. You know, he talked about climate change. He issued this groundbreaking encyclical called the Laudato Si, in which he said climate change is an urgent crisis, and he denounced what he called this throwaway culture. So that's really, too, how the Pope is more than just a religious leader for Catholics around the world. He's also a moral leader, bringing attention to issues like climate change. And, of course, we talked about what he talked about with migration and the culture of indifference, he said, to migrants around the world. So there's much of that, I think, too, that will be discussed in the coming days about how Pope Francis has led left his mark not only on the Catholic Church, but around the world. And then, of course, Errol, that's why we will see so many world leaders, including President Trump, come here for that funeral mass on Saturday.
And then you wonder how much of that now will spill over into the next papacy. You know, it's fair to call this Pope Francis's conclave, considering he appointed, I think, about 80% of the cardinals. Is there a common thread that's detectable yet?
It's a great point. There will be the College of Cardinals is already beginning to meet. Some met this morning, and the rest are coming from all over the world for the funeral, and then, of course, for that conclave. You have to be under the age of 80 to vote in that conclave. There are about 135 cardinals who will vote, and as you mentioned, Pope Francis appointed about 110 of them. So they will meet in the Sistine Chapel, which is just right over my shoulder, right here. They will put on top what is essentially the exhaust pipe for so that we can see whether there's black smoke or white smoke, because after each ballot, they can hold up to 4 ballots a day. They will burn those ballots because, remember, they're secret ballots. And if there's black smoke, it means we don't have a pope. And when there's white smoke, we will know that we have a new pope. But I think, what you asked is, because Pope Francis chose many of these cardinals, they embody many of his values. And so that's a real question. Will the next pope be a lot like Francis in his compassion and inclusivity, or will a more conservative or doctrinal pope be chosen? And that's what we'll be watching for at that conclave, and as many of the cardinals gather here and we begin to talk to them.
And it's also what makes this such an interesting moment. No one truly knows what happens next. Nora O'Donnell, great to see you once again. Thanks so much. The Vatican says Pope Francis died after suffering a stroke and irreversible heart failure. As you recall, he was hospitalized with double pneumonia earlier this year for about 5 weeks. CBS News medical contributor Dr. Celine Gounder is here with me in Studio 57 to speak about this. She's the editor-at-large for public health at KFF. So, Dr. Gounder, good morning to you. Great to have you here in studio. What more do we know about the circumstances surrounding the Pope's death?
Well, as you mentioned, it's being reported that he had a stroke followed by a coma, so he was then unconscious after the stroke, and then after that developed irreversible heart failure. So essentially his heart stopped functioning. And we're being told that the kind of stroke he had is what's called a hemorrhagic stroke, which means he had bleeding into the brain.
Okay, so this sounds actually quite severe. We don't know the timing of it. We hope that perhaps it was, overnight while he was sleeping, but do we know how long he may have been in a coma, or at what point it would have been clear there was no return?
Right. So his last public appearance was on Sunday. We're understanding that he deteriorated over the course of the evening, and then by 7:35 in the morning was declared dead. So we're talking about perhaps a matter of hours that he would have been in that coma.
He was given guidance from his doctors to stay at home, not to go out, not to meet with people. And as we've been reporting, that's just his drive. He wanted to do that. Is there any connection, does it seem, based on the diagnosis of his death, between him being out, being so public this past weekend, and that hemorrhaging which led to the coma?
It's really hard to say. He had a number of chronic medical conditions, as well as his most recent illness that would have predisposed to this. So he had high blood pressure and diabetes, both of which are risk factors for stroke. High blood pressure also weakens the blood vessels, which can increase the risk of the hemorrhagic stroke that he had, so the bleeding into the brain. And then he also had a complication during his hospitalization with the double pneumonia. He had low platelets, and platelets are cells in your body that help you clot. So if you have low platelets, your risk of bleeding also goes up. So he had a number of different factors that put him at high risk for something like this, and that may still have happened even if he had been taking more time to rest for himself.
That's a really interesting point. As a public figure, Pope Francis's health, of course, had been a topic of scrutiny, but he seemed quite open with the issues he was having. Is that something that you, as a public health professional, appreciate? Is that something we should encourage? Because these are also very personal, difficult things for any of us to deal with.
I think it's another form of leadership, that he was so transparent about his health. And the fact is, we are going to be seeing more and more elderly leaders in their 80s, perhaps even in their 90s. Our last president, our current president are examples of these older leaders. And I think the question is, how do we support them with their health needs? And that is going to shift as we have people who are more frail, have more chronic medical conditions, and so on.
Hopefully there's more acceptance to just being transparent. Dr. Gounder, thanks so much. Appreciate you being here.
With Pope Francis's death, the church will be preparing to elect its new pope in just a few weeks. So we want to take a closer look at this process. CBS News confirmed executive producer Melissa Matani has more on this.
The process to elect a pope is known as conclave, Latin for conclave, which translates as with key, because the voting takes place in top secret, with cardinals, the church's most senior officials, locked in the Vatican's Sistine Chapel. Here's how it works. First, the electors are chosen. These are cardinals who are less than 80 years old, and there are only 120 spots. Currently, there are 252 cardinals and 138 who meet the age requirements. Once that's decided, a special mass is held in the Sistine Chapel with all cardinals, electors, and non-voting members. The electoral cardinals pledge on a Bible an oath of absolute secrecy. They are then sealed into the Vatican until a pope is elected to prevent any type of external influence on the decision process. Inside, each cardinal will write his choice on a piece of paper and then place it in a large chalice that's located in front of Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment. Those votes are then opened and read aloud. It takes a 2/3 majority for an individual to be chosen as pope. So after the counting, the ballots are burned in a furnace with specific chemicals to make one of two kinds of coloured smoke. The smoke will be black if a pope has not been chosen and white if he has. And this is a sign that thousands of people that are camped out in St. Peter's Square will be looking for. Now, there can be up to 4 rounds of voting each day. In past centuries, papal elections could take weeks, but they've gone much faster in the 20th and 21st centuries. Once a new pope is chosen, that person will pick their papal name, which is different than their birth name. Those papal names like Benedict XVI, Francis, or John Paul II are often indicators of an individual's philosophy to the job. After that, a cardinal will announce to the world from the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square, Habemus Papam, which means we have a pope. The new pontiff then introduces himself to the world.